Welcome to the STEM Pathways podcast, where we delve into the fascinating world of science, technology, engineering, and math. I'm your host, Rohan Sharma, a passionate explorer of all things STEM. Each episode, we bring you captivating stories, cutting edge research, and inspiring interviews with experts and enthusiasts who are pushing the boundaries of innovation. Whether you're a student, a professional, or just curious about how the world works, join us as we unlock the mysteries of the universe and explore the endless possibilities of STEM. Let's get started. Today, I'll be interviewing Stephen Chase, who holds a bachelor's from CalTech, master's from Berkeley, and Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins in biomedical engineering. How are you doing today?
Excellent. Thanks for having me here.
And thanks for coming on the podcast. So to get started, I wanted to ask what your journey started like in high school.
Sure. I always knew that I wanted to do something STEM related. That's the stuff that interested me the most. And then when I was deciding on, what school I should go to for college, I chose the school that I got into that was as far away physically from where I grew up as possible. Not because I didn't like my parents or anything like that. I actually had a great home life, but because I really wanted to see what life was like on my own and experience it somewhere else. So I grew up in Mason, New Hampshire, which is a tiny little town, 800 people back when I was born. And I did my bachelor's at CalTech, so out in Pasadena, California.
Yeah. And what was your experience like while getting your bachelor's?
It was intense. I got there and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I knew it was STEM related. I started, as a freshman, I thought I might major in computer science. So I took a lot of computer science classes as a freshman. And then I thought, well, I don't really want to sit in front of a computer, 8 hours a day, every day. So I looked through the booklet and applied physics had the most classes that had the coolest sounding names. And so I chose applied physics and I majored in that.
Yeah. So what made you want to move on and get a master's?
So when I finished my bachelor's, I applied for PhD programs and simultaneously applied for jobs. And when I was interviewing for jobs, I'd go through and I meet with a bunch of people, and then I'd sit down with the boss, the interviewer, at the end of it, and he'd sort of do a summary. And and one of them, I forget which company it was, but he sat down and he looked at me and he said, "Look, I could offer you a job, but you really should get a master's. Just chatting with you all day, it seems really clear that you're not done learning yet." And so I thought that was great advice. And I chose to go to Berkeley, and I was actually enrolled in a PhD program there in electrical engineering.
Yeah. So what made you switch over to Johns Hopkins from Berkeley for the PhD?
Yeah, so for my PhD project, I was designing semiconductor lasers, which was a lot of fun. And I was looking for new ways to sort of increase their tuning range and make them laze at different frequencies. Um, and then one day, it was my turn to do Journal Club. And Journal Club is this event where a lab gets together and they will explore some topic. And usually it's led by a different graduate student each week. And it sort of gives you familiarity with the field and that sort of thing. And I had assigned myself the problem of comparing silicon photodetectors, which were things we could make in the lab, to the human eye, just for fun, just to see how well could we design something and would it work better than biology. And so I was researching this for Journal Club, and I started getting interested in nerve electrical interfaces and why we can't build an eye. And you don't have to think about that for very long before you realize it's because you can't plug it in, right? And so I started reading about nerve electrical interfaces and all of these, interesting papers that weren't what I was studying. And so this was all in my first year, and maybe as my second year. And so I went to my advisor very nervously, and I said, I've sort of fallen in love with a new field. I really want to pursue this neural engineering thing. And she was super supportive. She's like, yeah, you really got to pursue what drives you. And so I left Berkeley with a master's and applied for biomedical engineering programs and chose the one at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah. So one thing I know about Johns Hopkins is that they have like the highest funding out of any university for research. How did that affect your experience there?
Yeah, I had a lot of opportunities there to sort of look around and pursue what I wanted to pursue. And and one of the things back when I went through the biomedical engineering graduate program there, all of the graduate students there took the first year of med school, which was fantastic for me because my background was entirely physics and engineering, and I didn't know much about physiology or about how the body worked. And so I took the first year of med school, and it was like drinking from a fire hose. It was 8 hours of lecture a day where we just talked about how human bodies work, and it was fantastic. Every day was something new, and I really got to absorb a ton of knowledge in it. And then, sort of from all of that, the brain really fascinated me the most, just like it had when I was at Berkeley. And so in my second year, started working with a professor there named Eric Young on looking at how neurons encode information about the outside world. And I just sort of fell in love with that research. Principles, but really trying to decipher what the brain is doing.
Yeah. Can we actually dive a little bit deeper into your PhD research?
Sure. So I went and I chatted with Dr. Young because he was looking for students, and I said, I'm new to this whole field of neuroscience. I don't really know what I want to do yet, but you gave a talk. The faculty were looking for students. They give short talks about what their research is and about what they're looking for. And in your talk, you mentioned something about quantifying information in neurons. And that sounded really fascinating. Could you tell me more about that? He said, absolutely. So there's this field of information theory. Have you heard of it? I said, I've never heard of that. And he said, all right, so here's how it works. You can actually use probability, and you can use math and probabilities and look at how different stimuli that you present to a neuron and change the neuron's firing rate, how they change its firing rate. And from that, you can compute how much information it's carrying about the stimulus. And I want to use this to understand how the brain encodes and figures out where sounds are located. And the way the brain does that is by integrating information from a bunch of different cues. So, for example, if the sound is louder in this ear than it is in this ear, it's likely that the speaker is coming from this side. If it arrives at this ear sooner than it arrives at this ear, it's likely that the sound is coming from this side. And then it looks at the frequency content of the sound. And the reason we have these really complex folds in our ears is that it filters sounds differently depending on where they're coming from, so that it can help you localize where they're from. And he said, and I want to figure out how it puts all this information together. So I want to record from neurons in the brain and then use this information theory, this math that we can do based on the probabilities of responses. And I want to understand how neurons are figuring out where sounds are located. And so I said, that sounds fascinating. Sign me up. And that was a very fun sort of 6 years of research.
Yeah. So when along this journey did you realize that you wanted to go into academia?
uh, at I I didn't until I ended up sort of in my postdoc position. And so at the end of my PhD, again, just like I did after my bachelor's, I applied for jobs, industry jobs, and I also applied for some essentially jobs in academia, so postdoctoral position. So this is the position you get after you get your PhD, but before you're ready to be a professor. And I applied for them both. And again, I got interviews and offers in both sides. And I sort of weighed my options. I was like, what do I really want to do? Industry pay, but I'm really excited about the kinds of science I could still do in a postdoctoral position. And ultimately, it just came down to I'm still super curious and I want to do what's fun. So I chose the postdoc.
Yeah. And what was your research about there?
Yeah, so that is where I finally got back to this issue about nerve electrical interfaces and communicating with the nervous system. So for my postdoctoral research, I started working in a joint position. This is at Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. And so I was working with Andy Schwartz at the University of Pittsburgh, and he designed brain-computer interfaces. And brain-computer interfaces are these devices where you can record from neurons and try and decode the information that they're carrying about what you're thinking. And the application for this particular work was to understand from neurons in motor cortex, the part of the brain that controls movements, to try and predict what movements you might be thinking about. And so this is for patients who might be paralyzed from the neck down. And so they no longer have the ability to move because maybe they have spinal cord injury or something like that. And so the idea would be you could look at neurons in motor cortex and estimate what movements the subject is thinking about, and then use that information to move a robotic arm or a cursor on a computer screen. And so this kind of combined my knowledge that I'd done about information theory and coding in neural circuits with this new field of brain-computer interfaces. And so this was a joint position. I was working in statistics with Rob Cass on the mathematical front, and then in neurobiology with Andy Schwartz at the University of Pittsburgh. And I kind of got to put it all together and start working on brain-computer interfaces then.
So how different is being a professor versus being a postdoc? And how much more independent are you as a professor?
Yeah, so I had a lot of freedom as a postdoc to pursue the projects that I wanted to do. So the first project I did was a project that Andy Schwartz and Rob Cass had dreamt up and had funding for. And so the first one I did was that. And then there was, they kind of let me loose and there's like, what projects do you want to do? And I said, I'm really super interested in motor learning and I want to keep doing that. So I got to design some of my own work. And so I had a lot of independence as a postdoc. And now as a professor, the main difference is that I no longer conduct the experiments on my own. I have PhD students and postdocs who conduct the experiments. So I don't get the hands-on in the laboratory work, but I get to work on a lot more projects than I worked on when I was a postdoc. When I was a postdoc, I focused on one project and I went super deep into it, and everything about it was all what I was doing. And now as a professor, I get to supervise across, I'm working on probably 10 projects right now across the various students in my lab. And so I get to, I'm not involved in the day-to-day, but I get to see a lot more science happening. So in that sense, it's a lot more fun.
Yeah. So can you talk about some of the real-world applications of your research?
Sure. So these days, I'm still working on how we can make brain-computer interfaces better, and also how we can use brain-computer interfaces as a tool to do some basic science. And so in terms of real-world applications, the idea is still, we have patients who are paralyzed, they can't move. Maybe they've got spinal cord injury, maybe they've had a stroke, maybe they've got Lou Gehrig's disease. And the goal is to be able to read motor intent out of neurons in the brain and restore motor control abilities to these people. And whether that's controlling cursors on a computer screen or full, multi-degree of freedom robotic arms and hands so that they can do movement and grasp, even with sensory feedback. And so that's the real world applications that we're going for. And there's a lot of basic science still that needs to be done with that kind of research. Right now, there are clinical trials happening where patients can do that. They can move robotic arms. Some of the issues with that are that the implanted electrodes only last about 5 years before the signals decay away. And so we need electrodes that will work for the entire life of the patient. Another issue is that the signals that are recorded from a certain set of electrodes tend to migrate over day. And the information that they carry tends to change across time. And so you have to continually update and calibrate your device. And so we're working on solutions to solve that problem. The other issues that we have are that the signals get contaminated with what we call nuisance variables. And so other things that you might be thinking of when you're moving, like, am I angry or am I happy? Am I tired? A lot of your emotional responses actually modulate your neural responses, and they can change how we decode movements. And so we want to be able to decode movements correctly at all times. And so we have to understand how these other signals impact the representation of movement so that we can factor that into our decoding. So there's a lot of interesting scientific problems to work on to make the sort of clinical application side better.
Yeah. And then right now, that clinical application side, I'm guessing is just for people like amputees or people who need an extra limb to control.
That's the
Um,
idea right now. That's the sort of nearest term application. Other longer term applications that we're looking at, I had said that a lot of your emotions affect how you move, and they affect the representation of movement in motor cortex. And so another interesting area that we're pursuing is to try and understand how is it that these internal state signals, your emotional regulation, how alert you are, how motivated you are, how is it that they affect the computations that you do when you're trying to plan and execute movements? And some of the fun stuff that we've been working on really recently is to try and understand, when I offer different rewards, there are different outcomes for a movement. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're going to putt a golf ball into a cup, and I can set it so the cup is a certain away from your putter so that you do it about 70% of the time accurately. You get that ball into the cup. And then I told you, I'll give you $1 each time you put the ball in the cup. Chances are you do a little bit better than 70%. You'd up your success rate. And then I could say to you, you know what? I'll give you $2 each time you get that ball into the cup. And chances are you do a little bit better yet. It turns out, if I said, Rohan, I'll give you $10,000 if you get the ball into the cup. Statistically speaking, you'll do worse than 70%, right? You'll do about 50, 60% or so. And we call that choking under pressure. We see it in sports all the time. Like when the stakes are the absolute highest, for some reason, our motor actions aren't as good as they could be. And so we're trying to understand how that is. Why is it? What is it about these motivating scenarios that causes the neural computations for movement to fall apart right when you need them most? And we're working on strategies to try and decode motivational state out of the brain so that we can maybe feed it back to people so that they can regulate how motivated they are internally and actually optimize performance.
and when you modulate that, that would be through these electrodes you're putting in a brain. And then um, just to make sure I'm getting clear, so then those electrodes can get neurons to fire.
So they record neuron firing. So everything I've been talking about now is just sort of passively monitoring what the brain is doing.
Oh, okay. And then for what you were saying for regulating motivation, how would that work?
Yeah, so you could imagine doing it directly from neurons. But that would only work if, you had invasive brain surgery and did that. So that I think would be the step one. Maybe we could do that study as part of the clinical trials that patients are going through now and look at how emotions regulate those signals. But ideally, what we'd want is to be able to record those signals non-invasively. So through electrodes that are just placed on the scalp, like EEG electrodes or something like that. So ideally, we would go to non-invasive signals, still be able to read out these kinds of emotional states, and then provide feedback where you can self-regulate them.
Yeah. So I think I've heard of some research where during like an open brain surgery, they stimulate different parts of the brain, and then the patient can be awake and like say what they're feeling. Have you looked at any research like that at all?
Yeah, I haven't conducted any research like that, but it's super fascinating. So there's this guy, Wilder Penfield, who really pioneered the technique of doing that. And the major reason he was conducting that research is for epilepsy. And so there are certain types of epilepsy which can't be cured with drugs. And the only cure is to surgically essentially burn out the part of the brain that's causing seizures. And when you do that, you want to make sure that you're not going to burn a part of the brain that's super critical for what you do every day. And so, for example, you don't want to damage the part of the brain that's responsible for forming memory. You don't want to damage the part of the brain that's responsible for allowing you to speak, that sort of thing. So what Wilder Penfield did is he did brain surgery on subjects who are awake. And you can do that because despite the fact that the brain is filled with neurons, it actually doesn't have any pain sensors in it. and he would stimulate in various places and ask the subjects, has that affected you? So he could tell if, they weren't able to speak, or he could tell if they suddenly twitched, or if they weren't able to see. The subject would be able to report that to them. And so for that, he was able to map out parts of the brain and try and understand, okay, which parts of the brain are super critical. You definitely don't want to damage them over the course of an epilepsy surgery. And which parts, when you damage them, it doesn't seem to have immediate short-term effects. So,
And when he was doing that, was that with electrodes that were just recording function? Or was he
no, that was
actually
electrodes where you could actually drive current into them. And so when you do that, what you do is you end up taking the small part of the brain offline for a little while. So you don't damage it, but you can take it offline for a moment and then assess, by taking that small piece of brain tissue offline, how has it affected what you can do?
okay? So right now, what do you think your research is heading to
Yeah.
for the next like 10 years?
I don't know. I'm super interested in these internal state signals and how these, like motivation, how it's able to regulate these computational processes about how we execute movements. So one of the things we started doing is looking at perception. Does motivation affect your ability to perceive the outside world? Turns out it does. Turns out you can run the same exact case where, I'll offer you $1 or $2 for $10,000. And when you're being offered $10,000, it turns out your ability to detect a small change in a stimulus goes down. And so something about motivational signals are impacting how you're perceiving stimuli, how you're executing movements. It's certainly influencing how you're deciding to act. And so we want to understand this. So that's one of the directions the lab is heading in. Other directions are to continue studying motor learning and motor memory processes. We're going to continue working on.
Yeah. So for my last question, I wanted to ask if you have one piece of advice for someone who's still in high school or early in college wanting to follow a similar career path as you.
Yeah. My advice is I talk to a lot of students who get very stressed out about not knowing what they want to do, or not having certainty in what that career path is. My career path didn't settle itself out until I was 30, in my 30s. At each step, it's made logical sense at the time, and I just followed my heart. This seems like it could be really fun, and I'd like to do that. And I think that you really have to be passionate about something to do really well at it. And when you're passionate at something, you excel at it. And so I would say to those who, it's okay if you don't have it all figured out. It is okay to follow your heart and work on what you're really good at. And that's when really interesting things can happen.
All right, then. Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.